Hi everyone! This is the read aloud of Left Treachery and Other Terrors. We are charging towards the end by jumping into chapters 28 and 29 today. Here we go. Chapter 28, Annoying the Twins. Alexander woke to the sound of a commotion rising up from the street. He sat up, realizing that he still had one of his letters in his hand. The other two had slipped onto the floor. He rolled out of bed and collected them, slipping them back into their hiding place before throwing open the window. People were coming out of the surrounding buildings and making their way toward the palace. "What's happening?" Florian yawned. "I have no idea," Alexander answered, "but I have an awful feeling about it." There was a frantic knock on the door. Alexander turned to answer, but Florian grabbed his shoulder. "Filbert, answer that," he ordered. "Answering the door isn't going to kill me," Alexander objected, but Filbert had already slipped through the curtain and opened it. Alexander couldn't see the door, but he heard the voice of the guard who had recognized him the week prior. "By order of the gods, the people must all assemble in the Forum of St. Valerian." The man said nothing else, but rushed away to deliver his message to the next set of residents. Alexander quickly dressed and was about to exit when Florian caught him by the shoulder a second time. "I'll go out first, then you, then Filbert will take up the rear." He looked at his brother. "Do not let him out of your sight." "I'll be all right," Alexander promised. "Of course you will," Filbert growled, "as long as you listen to us and don't do anything stupid." Lonzo jumped off Alexander's bed and tried to follow them out, but Alexander pushed him back through the door. "Not this time," he whispered. "No barking." The three were pushed along in the crowd's current until they were parallel to Lysander's borrowed obelisk. The entire Senate, Alexander counted twice to be sure, was assembled on the marble staircase before the palace gate. Two beautiful figures stood on the terrace above them. They were dressed in silk and adorned with gold. Alexander knew from a single glimpse that these were Jace and Acacia. "I'm so glad you've all come," Acacia announced as the crowd gathered around. "I think you are going to like what we have to tell you." "It's come to our attention," Jace began, "that many of you are beginning to question whether you should follow us." "It's only natural that you would," Acacia soothed. "Doesn't every child question their parents from time to time?" Alexander worked his way toward the front of the crowd, ignoring Filbert and Florian's orders for him to stay back. It took some doing as the people were packed in shoulder to shoulder. "And when children rebel, isn't it necessary for their parents to correct them?" Acacia added. "Certainly," Jace agreed. "Not to punish, of course, but merely to explain why they need their parents' guidance." Alexander stopped behind the first line of spectators. Up close, he recognized many of the senators and didn't want to risk being recognized himself. "You need us because you are evil," Jace explained. "It's that simple. You fight, you steal, you act selfishly, and you need us gods to," he smiled venomously, "help you practice virtue." "We'll show you what we mean," Acacia continued, and then gestured towards the senators before her. "You, the people, have decided that these men are the wisest in your kingdom and the most worthy of respect." A few of the spectators snickered. "You've selected them to govern over you, to represent you. Yet there is not an honest man among them." The woman adjacent to Alexander rolled her eyes and mumbled, "I'm shocked." Those around her stifled their laughter. "Each of these men," Acacia continued, "has claimed to be superior to the others, some by their intellect, some by their deeds, and some by being of noble birth. Now we demand a sacrifice," Jace smiled, "and we, as gods, demand only the best that humans can offer." He turned to the senators. "Tell me, which of you is the greatest? That man will be sacrificed." The square suddenly became so silent you could hear a scorpion scuttling on the cobblestone. The senators all looked at each other. "Well, gentlemen," Acacia pressed, "you've always seemed so sure about this before. Why the hesitation?" That's when Alexander became aware of an opportunity, one he couldn't afford to miss. He heard Filbert and Florian working their way through the crowd behind him. He had only seconds to act, and that was probably a good thing because he didn't want to think too much about what he was going to do. He broke from the crowd. Filbert and Florian swore as he slipped from their grasp and stood at the base of the stairs. "I'll make this easy for you," he exclaimed. "I am the greatest by virtue of my birth, and I would gladly offer myself as a sacrifice to the gods." The corner of his lip turned up very slightly as he added, "I only ask that they would honor me by taking my life with their own hands." "It's true," cried one of the senators. "This is Prince Alexander, son of our late King Basil. No one can claim to be more worthy than him." The entire Senate agreed, all affirming his identity, even the few who hadn't met him, and acknowledging his kingship. A murmur ran through the people as Alexander's neighbors suddenly realized why he looked familiar. Meanwhile, Jace and Acacia burst out laughing and didn't stop till they had almost suffocated themselves. "You know something?" Jace coughed. "I can't remember the last time I was surprised." "Delightful, isn't it?" Acacia replied. "I'd almost forgotten how it felt. You've done us a great service, Your Majesty." "Why don't we spare him?" Jace suggested. "He can pick which senator should be sacrificed." "Excellent suggestion," Acacia answered. She walked a few steps down. "How about him?" She pointed to one of the men Alexander remembered as being particularly supportive of his execution. Alexander furrowed his brow and stood silently for a moment, as if in deep thought. What he was actually doing was reading the crowd. The Calathians were captivated by the scene unfolding before them, eager to see how Alexander was going to test their gods. The cults were watching the Calathian guardsmen posted around the square. Most of them were Filbert and Florian's knights, present to protect Alexander and their own kings if trouble arose. Filbert and Florian were both motioning to Alexander in an attempt to communicate their displeasure without revealing themselves. Alexander responded to them with a subtle shrug. Then he answered the fairies. "By my order, we will not sacrifice anyone to you, because you are not gods and we owe you nothing. If you want someone sacrificed, you will have to do it yourselves." How such a large crowd could go so silent, Alexander didn't know. It was like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what the gods would do to him. "He's much bolder than I remember," Jace smirked. "Last time I saw him, it seemed the only word he knew was Fosta." Acacia put her hand on her brother's shoulder and gave him a nostalgic smile. "Oh yes, I remember that. Even when she finally sentenced him, he couldn't quite comprehend her betrayal. He just kept saying her name until they dragged him off." Alexander felt himself wincing at their words. An anger more pure and more ravenous than he'd ever felt before was bubbling up inside him. And that was exactly what they wanted. He breathed deeply and silently prayed for the grace to keep calm. "I know what you are," Alexander stated. "I cannot force you to leave, but I will not serve you either. And I will not allow you to terrorize my people any longer." "Is that so?" Acacia smiled, then looking up at the crowd held up a finger. "A moment, please." All at once, Alexander was standing in a private room in the palace. Jace and Acacia were both lounging on couches, looking at him as if he'd just played an excellent practical joke. "Why are you here?" Jace asked. "I mean, why are you really here? Is it because you want vengeance, or because you cannot resist the chance to be king?" Alexander turned his back to them. He knew they had no interest in dialogue. They were trying to manipulate him. The more he engaged them, the more tools they would have at their disposal. No, Acacia answered her brother. "You see, taking vengeance or reclaiming his kingdom would be handling his problems. It's Alexander's nature to ignore his problems and hope they go away, just as he is ignoring us now." "So why do you think he's here?" Acacia thought. "Probably guilted into it by some internal sense of duty." "How incredibly arrogant," Jace remarked. Alexander wondered what he meant by that, but remained silent. "Isn't it, though?" Acacia agreed. "To think that God bestowed some divine mission on him. Alexander would never ignore such a calling, not even if it meant sacrificing everything. I can see why his sister resents him. He's so obnoxiously perfect." "You've broken him," Jace commented. "Do you hear his little heart racing?" Were they right? Guilt was part of the reason he returned. As he muddled the whole thing over in his head, he was struck with a horrible thought. What if he'd put the lives of Ilona, her brothers, and all those loyal cults in danger simply to satisfy his own pride? He questioned himself, retracing every event, every thought, and every prayer that had led him to where he was now, second-guessing everything until nothing made sense anymore. Who was he to think he could save his people? He had been an awful king the first time. He would be an awful king now. He was worthless, selfless, hopeless, and incompetent. His interference would only make things worse. Silently, he called to God, saying, I don't know if I did the right thing. I don't know if my motivations were good or evil. But don't let any harm result from my actions, please. With or without me, save my people from these tormentors. As he prayed, 2 words popped into his mind, the summary of all Ida's warnings. Don't play. Alexander turned back to them. I have nothing to say to you privately. Now return me to my people, or I will walk back on my own. Aren't you going to ask? Jace began. No, Alexander snapped. Where your sister is? Jace finished. Alexander's heart pounded. He desperately wanted to know this. It was bait. He wouldn't bite. No, he affirmed, and began walking toward the exit. Suddenly, he found himself stumbling backward and landed with a splash in a shallow pool of water. When his alarm wore off and he was able to orient himself, he saw he was sitting in a fountain in the forum where he began. He was on the northern side in front of the cathedral. The place was still crowded with people, talking among themselves as they tried to make sense of events. Alexander couldn't believe it. The twins threw him into a fountain. He had no idea why it made him so angry. After all, he was expecting them to torment him, or find some roundabout way of killing him. He never expected something so juvenile. Were they superior beings, or spiteful little children? A woman nearby noticed his stumble and rushed over to offer him her hand. He couldn't help but smile when he recognized Ilona. Are you all right? She asked. Fine, thank you, Alexander replied. They didn't get into your head and make you second-guess yourself or anything? No, Alexander lied, and then immediately felt guilty. Before he could retract his denial, she spoke. Your cultic assistants are looking for you. They seem very upset. One of them was saying if the gods returned you safely, he was going to kill you himself. You really are irritating the twins, you know. Which twins? Alexander asked. Both pairs, actually, she grinned. Well done. Alexander glanced around. The people nearby were starting to notice his reappearance and spreading word to their neighbors. He gave Ilona's hand a little squeeze and said, Thank you, miss. She replied with a warm smile before disappearing into the crowd. As he stepped out of the fountain, the people circled around him, all talking at once, all asking him and each other what had happened and where he'd been. Then one of them remembered he was king and knelt before him. All the others followed suit. As Alexander stood, wet and disheveled, looking over his kneeling subjects, he turned slightly pink and remembered how much he hated being the center of attention. He forgot his humiliation, however, when Jace and Acacia appeared on either side of him. The people fell back, unwilling to stand near the hostile beings. The gods were looking particularly smug. Acacia was tossing an apple between her hands playfully. All right, your majesty, she sighed. My brother and I discussed it and agreed to surrender your kingdom peacefully if... I don't need you to surrender anything, Alexander asserted. This kingdom never belonged to you, and it isn't yours to return to me. But you do want us to leave, don't you? She asked sweetly. Absolutely, Alexander replied. We will leave you all in peace if you prove yourself worthy by passing 3 trials. No, Alexander returned. Why do you keep acting like this is some kind of negotiation? I can't make you leave, but I'm not going to serve you either. Stay or go, it's up to you. Jace reached out and grabbed Alexander by the sleeve. There it was, that inhuman strength and the powerlessness he felt every time he was confronted with it. We've tried to be patient with you, Alexander, he threatened, but I'm afraid your insolence requires a firmer hand. Fine, punish me, Alexander snapped. Call down fire from heaven to consume me. Crush me beneath the rubble of these buildings. Send me to my god however you see fit. The amusement subsided from the twins' faces. When they made no immediate response, Alexander looked at the sky with an expression of mock concern. Is heaven out of fire? He jested. A few of the spectators chuckled. It was only then that Acacia demonstrated her superhuman strength. She crushed the apple she was holding in her fist. It exploded, sending pulp flying in all directions. She jumped and looked at the sticky mess in her palm with disgust. She drew a cloth from the air and used it to wipe her hand clean. I'm not omnipotent or anything, but if you could materialize a cloth, couldn't you simply dematerialize the pulp? Alexander observed. The crowd erupted into laughter. Jace released Alexander's shoulder with a little shove, sending him tumbling to the ground. Arrest him, Acacia ordered. Alexander leapt to his feet and looked to see if the guards were obeying. He prayed they wouldn't. The cults would rush to his aid, and the last thing he wanted was cults and Calatheans fighting. He saw some approaching to his dismay. Even if he ordered the cults not to interfere, Filbert and Florian wouldn't listen. Stop, one of the senators shouted as he pushed his way through the crowd and stood in front of Alexander. Did we not just acknowledge him as king? It was Senator Clement. He addressed the twins. If you want to punish him, do it yourselves. All the people cried out in agreement. The rest of the Senate, fearing their voters more than any kind of god, also ordered the guards to stand down. Jace exchanged a look with his sister. She mouthed something to him, and he responded with a nod. Then, all at once, Alexander couldn't draw breath. No one was touching him. He couldn't feel anything in his throat, yet he couldn't inhale. Is something wrong, Your Majesty? Acacia questioned. You're turning blue. Alexander looked at Jace. He was standing just behind his sister. His arms were crossed and his brow was furrowed. Alexander could see his own pain reflected in Jace's eyes. Jace couldn't torment him indefinitely. Relief had to be imminent. Alexander crumpled to his knees, gasping unsuccessfully. Suddenly, air filled his lungs. Never in his life had he tasted anything so sweet. His breath left him again as quickly as it returned. Jace was now standing before him, releasing a string of vile insults, while Acacia stood aside in pained silence. They were switching places, sharing the burden so they could continue tormenting him. Until what? Whichever one killed him would die also. Alexander crumpled to the ground, and then everything faded, and he remembered no more. The end. Not really. Chapter 29. The Genie Bottle. Alexander woke in a place unlike any he'd ever seen. He sat up, rubbing his horribly sore throat, and drank in the unusual room. It was a large cylinder shape with a dome for a ceiling. Right in the center of the dome was the circular entrance to a tunnel of some sort. It was wide enough for Alexander to crawl through, but impossible to reach. It was the only way in or out of the room as far as he could see. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all crafted from a single piece of red glass. The perimeter was littered with objects, pots, books, scrolls, and all manner of baubles. Alexander stood and pressed his face against the wall, trying to see through the glass. He could only make out shapes and shadows. So someone's been telling you our secrets, came Acacia's voice. Alexander spun around to see the twins standing a few paces behind him. Did they tell you there are plenty of ways to make someone miserable without killing them? Like trapping them in a bottle for 2,000 years, Jace explained cheerily. Fortunately for you, you won't live that long. Remind me, how long do these things live, sister? Oh, 90 years maybe, if you take good care of them, Acacia shrugged, though he probably wouldn't live half a century on his own. It's amazing how many things can kill humans. Not fairies, Alexander observed. Are you sure about that? Acacia sneered. Because the Calatheans just saw us kill you. And begged us to forgive them for rebelling, Jace added. Alexander found this story highly unlikely. He didn't know what the people actually saw, but someone must have noticed how much effort the twins expended strangling him. Even if the people thought he was dead, they must realize that the twins couldn't possibly threaten an entire city full of people unless they had the patience to kill each person individually over a long period of time. He thought about making a cynical reply, but he was too exhausted to think of anything clever, and his throat still hurt. You know something? Acacia smiled. I think this is a more suitable punishment than death. Abandoned in this bottle, tormented by his loneliness, forgotten by his loved ones. What loved ones? Jace asked. No one loves him, thanks to us. Alexander longed for something to shove into his ears. Being alone sounded like paradise after listening to the twins babble on all day. Acacia snorted. Now that I think about it, being with his family is probably worse than being separated from them. What a shame we can't bring Justin back to keep him company. What about her? Jace asked, pointing to a huddled figure leaning against the opposite wall. Alexander could have sworn she wasn't there a minute ago. Her head was bent, and her long, dark hair fell around her face, blocking his view. She looked up when Jace motioned to her. Alex, she gasped. Alexander felt a rush of anger at the sight of his sister. His cheeks flushed red. He turned his back to her and stood with his arms crossed, glaring at the floor. It seems you two have a lot to talk about, Acacia smiled. Take your time. You have forever. With that, the twins disappeared. After what did indeed seem like eternity, Fosta spoke in a voice so small he could barely hear her. I'm glad you're alive. Alexander ignored her. I know you don't want to talk to me, she continued, so I'll say just one more thing and keep quiet. Everything that happened is my fault, and I'm sorry. She sank to the floor, buried her face in her knees, and for a long time the room was still. The only sound was an occasional sniffle from Alexander. He spent so many long hours since his banishment, thinking up things he would say if he ever saw her again. In that moment, he forgot them all. When he turned to face her and opened his mouth to speak, the only word that escaped was, "Why?" Because it wasn't fair. While Father was sick and Justin was off drinking himself to oblivion, I was keeping this kingdom together. I know why you usurped me, Alexander interrupted. Why didn't you kill me? What do you mean? Fosta asked. Of course I wouldn't kill you, Alex. Why not? You don't love me. Of course I do. Do you slander everyone you love? He snapped. Perhaps it was some sentimental attachment. I was like some old doll you'd outgrown but couldn't part with. That's not true, she scowled. That's exactly what it was. You were a little girl and I was a baby without a mother. You rocked me and dressed me and carried me everywhere. Then you grew up and there I was, getting in the way. She leapt to her feet and stood with her fist clenched, fuming. You forgot to mention that I had defended you and avenged you and then managed your kingdom for you. Show a little gratitude. Thank you for sentencing me to death and then changing your mind, Alexander replied dryly. I was supposed to kill you, she cried. How could I leave the kingdom in your hands when you were so incompetent and soft? She wiped a tear off her cheek. And kind and gentle and nothing like what a king should be. Good night, Fosta, Alexander stated. He curled up on the floor with his back to her. He doubted he would be able to sleep on the cold glass, but he was tired of talking to her. He was tired in every way. Alexander made a routine for himself. He started each morning with dawn prayer. He didn't know the actual time or the day, so he had to guess which psalms to use. Then he would explore his surroundings, looking through all the books and scrolls the fairies discarded. He almost fainted in awe when he found what he believed to be one of Reuven's original scrolls. Ilona would be so jealous if he was ever able to tell her about it. He found a large storage jar and placed the scroll inside. From then on, any time he found something he thought Ilona would like, he dropped it in the jar. In the days that followed, he added several more scrolls, coins, jewelry from empires long past, and a long spiral horn he thought belonged to a unicorn. It actually came from a narwhal. He would probably never be able to show her the things he collected, but doing it made him feel close to her, so he persisted. He noticed charcoal drawings scattered on the walls and started looking for the charcoal. He found a few charred sticks in one of the pots and began to cover the walls and floors in drawings of his own. Fosta tried to avoid him, which was difficult given the circumstances. She usually sat in her place with her face buried in her knees. He prayed again at 9 o'clock, or what he guessed was 9, and every 3 hours afterward until he went to sleep. Since the divine office was usually prayed in a group, he tried to convince Fosta to join him. She agreed, but was out of practice and kept forgetting bits and stumbling over words. Twice a day, food would materialize in the middle of the room. It consisted of dry bread and raw vegetables. Sometimes there was an egg or two. He was never starving, but never fully satisfied either. In a strange way, he found it amusing. The twins couldn't torture him, but they made sure he was always slightly uncomfortable. The room was always just a little too warm or a little too cold. He had left so quickly the morning they captured him that he forgot to put on his cloak. How he wished he had it to spread underneath him. As it was, he slept directly on the cold glass with one arm folded under his head like a pillow. He was dressed in a simple knee-length tunic with a belt around his waist and sandals on his feet. Alexander made a mark on the wall every morning, counting the days of his captivity. The more scratches he made, the more he longed for human companionship. Soon he became so desperate that he set aside his anger and spoke with Fausta for hours. He told her his story, leaving out only a few minor details, like the existence of Ilona. He didn't know if the twins were listening, but didn't want to chance it. When he told her about the service he rendered Filbert and Florian, she laughed. Father would be furious. He really hated cults. Did he? Alexander asked. I mean, more than any other barbarian people? Oh, yes, Fausta laughed. Strange how he could forgive Dresden for one drunken outburst after another, but couldn't forgive the cults for something that happened hundreds of years ago. Father loved Justin as much as either of us, Alexander rationalized. Really? Fausta questioned. Then why did he look the other way when Justin was abusing you? Alexander had no answer, and he didn't like to think about it. I, for one, will always be grateful to the cults, Fausta commented, for putting Justin in his place. She grinned and then added, They are the reason he drinks, you know. Alexander snorted. Justin had, at one time or another, blamed every living thing in the palace for his addiction. I wouldn't be this way if Father raised me right, he would say. To Fausta, he would assert, I wouldn't be like this if you weren't Father's favorite. He was particularly cruel to Alexander, telling him he wouldn't be a drunk if Alexander hadn't killed their mother. It took Fausta ages to convince Alexander he wasn't responsible. In all fairness, Alexander smiled. If Justin told me the cultic kings were the reason for his drinking, I might actually believe him. When they spoke about their past, their family, and all the good and the bad that came with it, it was almost like Fausta never betrayed him. She was the same sister he'd always known. But then he'd think about her betrayal, and it would hurt more deeply than ever. He'd go lie down in his usual place with his back to her. One evening, as Alexander was lying on the floor trying to sleep, he looked up at the wall and counted 59 marks. With the thought of the 60th day, the reality of his imprisonment pierced him. He was never going to see Ilona again. He rolled over to face the wall so Fausta wouldn't notice the tears on his cheeks. What if the twins' story was true and the people were worshipping them again? That would mean he lost her for nothing. He supposed he would never know what happened to his people. At least not in this life. The end of chapter 29. Next time we will read chapter 30. See you then.